Okay, so thank you very much for coming along. This presentation is quite deliberately designed as a bit of a show and tell. We have done and we will continue to do presentations on the totality of transferring relational databases to the archive. But we thought this might be an opportunity just to actually give you a look at some of the moving parts. So by necessity, given the time we've got and our pain threshold, I think it's really only going to look at some of the moving parts, but we'll bear in mind all the way through this is really part of an overall set of processes, and I'll mention a bit later on, but certainly we need to keep in front of mind is that these are some tools, technology tools, and some processes to use them. But by and large, the whole thing has to be within. It's got to be driven by, the records management and the business imperatives. Okay, so that none of that changes. So really, this is just another way. Think of this as just another channel for getting things into the archive, and the technology is. It matters because it's interesting. It enables us to do more things or do things with different objects, but ultimately the game's the same and the rules are the same, and none of that changes. So, transferring relational databases to PROV. If you've been alive for the last 30 years or working, certainly you'd be aware that pretty much everything that we use, every system we use, has databases running underneath it or supporting it. And for the last 30 years, the real dominant model, I guess, is a relational database model. And as a consequence, there's an awful lot of relational databases out there. There's a lot of public records that are held in relational databases. And until the last few years, there really hasn't been a way to offer to manage those in some way. So that's the sort of context we've got. And some of you may also be aware that the last decade or so, certainly it's speeded up in the last 5 years or so, there are emerging now new challenges, I suppose, to the domination of the relational database. So you may have heard of the NoSQL and the unstructured data management systems, that sort of thing. So these things, technology is always rolling, and we're always finding new ways to do things and more things to spend money on, I guess. But we can't get away from the fact that after 30 years or so, we've got an awful lot of stuff out there in this particular relational database model. So it's probably timely for us to have some way of managing that particular type of database. There are strengths and weaknesses in the relational model. One of the fabulous strengths is that there's a lot of formal and de facto industry standards for how they're designed, because the real powerful thing about them has been that they've been generally fairly consistently available to applications designers. So you can design an application pretty confidently that you can run a relational database underneath it. There's some common design standards there and that sort of thing. However, there's always proprietary standards as well, and so proprietary ways of doing things. So even though we have some similarities and a familiarity when you look at some of these, in fact, if it's developed in a particular product, such as Oracle or SQL Server or one of those, you can't just roll that over into another product, or you can't even necessarily migrate that into a later version very easily. So it's one of these issues that SIARD is quite useful in helping us with. It works on a principle of normalization. So what it tries to do is it converts your relational database into a flat XML type file, and in doing so it normalizes back to SQL 1999 standard. So it converts some of the proprietary nuances between products and brings it when it converts into that file. And then later that enables you through the same tool to convert back into another or the same database product, and it will be pretty confident we'll be able to run it on there. So it's quite useful in that respect. The actual process is at a high level, it's actually pretty simple. If you want to convert a relational database into SIARD format, you use the tool and you connect to it just as a database user would connect to it. And when I use the term database user, we're all users of databases, but through the applications that we interact with those applications will connect us as a type of user. So if we'll have a bunch of different roles in a database. So that's the kind of term. Certain users can see certain bits of data in your database based upon those roles, and SIARD makes use of the fact that we can connect them through one of those. Yeah, as I said, it gets us a kind of product-independent file, and it's in a format that is suitable for long-term storage, which is pretty important in our business. So I hope you can get the gist that we've got a kind of a process rolling across here. Here we've got an application, a business application sitting in an agency, and underneath it we've got a database supporting that application. It's been determined that that system might be about to be decommissioned or deemed otherwise incredibly high value or at risk in some way, and so it's decided that it's good to migrate the data across to the archive. So the process follows basically that we, or you in fact, convert the database into a SIARD format, producing a SIARD file, then wrap it up as a SIARD VO, transfer it to the archive, and the archive will hold that, and if there's a need to have it used, accessed, it can then be converted back into a database format and reloaded into a database and then accessed in an archival way. So in this demonstration, what we're aiming to do is to basically walk you through some of the big bits of that, if you like. We'll make these slides available to you later on, although as you'll see it's a bit like imagining the sound of one hand clapping. I'm running a screen recording, and if that works out okay, then we'll make that shareable as well. Okay, so all things being equal, you won't have to take too many notes as you go. So that's the plan for today. And once again, I'll remind you that we're looking at some of the moving parts, but we have to remind ourselves that this is being driven by the transfers and disposal process, both by you working with our team here. Okay, so it is really a records management thing. So here we are. What sort of products does it? What's the first question you need to ask, I guess, if you've got a system that you think is a candidate for transferring to the archive? Well, we can tell you that SIARD currently supports Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, IBM DB2, and Microsoft Access databases. And you're probably aware even though they're quite small and sometimes trivial, there's a hell of a lot of Access databases out there, and they're actually hard to manage because they're a bit grey. So this is actually quite a useful tool. Some of the applications we've seen so far, some of the feedback we've had is that this may actually be quite a handy and portable way to protect some of those or preserve some of those in a more discreet manner, rather than getting everybody to put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm running all these Access databases. You can do it a bit more discreetly than that. Okay, so, and as I said, this is what it currently supports. The IBM DB2 was only added in the last 12 months, so the developers who are based in Switzerland continue to, it's an active project, and they continue to add capabilities to it as the the market, I guess, demands. Currently, yeah, so that's what they support. So it's possible that they'll add a few more to that as they go, although as you can see, that's actually not a bad spread for a lot of what's sitting out there already. We've encountered, sorry. Will they go to Lotus Notes databases? That's a very good question, and we've got a lot of them out there, haven't we? Yeah, so it's an interesting proposition. I can actually give you a definitive answer. Given enough money, it will. we've had some figures informally quoted to us, and they're actually not, they're not eye-watering, but they're not the kind of thing that an agency would countenance. But if you got enough players in Australia, for instance, or across Victoria to think it was a worthwhile thing to do, then it actually could be quite cost effective, certainly. Having blithely said that, knowing that the underlying database in Lotus Notes is relational, but not knowing anything beyond that. So, okay, we've encountered some ingress stuff with DHHS and in our collaboration with them, and that's not supported by SIARD at the moment. However, that's a good example of, we had a look at it and we've actually worked out a migration workaround for it. And so even though it doesn't directly connect to it, we can actually migrate across to another platform and then preserve it using SIARD. So, one of the other considerations is you want to have some kind of platform for doing your conversions on, because you don't do these on sitting on top of real production systems. So what you want to do is have a I mean, I do an awful lot of stuff basically just on a laptop, so it's not really a big ticket item, but you do need to have a system that you can load up. You can install database products onto. You can load databases onto to start working on and do your conversions on. And I think this is another thing that's worth bearing in mind. And I know David Fowler, many of you will know, he's mentioned this a number of times, that it's always a question as to we should be considering do we need to be adding some of these capabilities to what we consider to be the skill set of an archivist? And I think that's a very worthy question. But it's also, I'd encourage you to bear in mind that you're not alone in this. You're working in an agency that's under the Act, and it's a shared responsibility really. So in many cases you've got people in your organisation already who have these skills, and so it's not so much a matter of having to do this all yourself, it's just a matter of knowing the right people, I guess, who can help you in doing these sorts of things. And it's always a pretty good idea, sensible idea. If you're going to embark on doing this, work off a copy of it, because there's nothing worse than burning the original. And as we'll get to it, there's good other reasons for doing that. And this is a bit that we're going to gloss over, but in fact this comes really to the heart of your work, I guess, your intellectual work as a records manager is identifying the data that you want. Sometimes it's quite apparent from a first glance that you want it all, and it's quite appropriate to take the whole database. In other cases there may be really good reasons not to take all the data, okay, for privacy or security reasons. And there may be other business purposes where you actually don't want to take all the database at this point in time, or you may want to take some of it later on. So for a variety of reasons you may need to actually have a way of working out what matters in the database, and I'm just going to palm that off and say that's a matter for appraisal, sentencing and that kind of stuff. Okay, that's where you, sorry. Yes?
And another one, because we have some records which over time we probably want to make available with all of that personal detail. Can you do it twice and then...
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So the idea of mixed content, where you've got some which is quite appropriate and proper to be made available today, and some which for equally good reasons shouldn't see the light of day or shouldn't even leave the premises for some time to come. And your suggestion of actually creating two copies, that's exactly the way we think about it. That's a sensible way. Many of you will be aware that you can actually, and it's quite legitimate in security terms, to restrict access based upon roles, so using role-based access control. Perfectly legitimate, but there's also nothing quite like fresh air between these things too. I think that's actually a very sensible approach. But a lot of these things, they do come down to specifics. So they appear to be complex on the face of it, but once you actually look at a particular system with a particular database and you have a look at the data within it, then some of those decisions are much more clear cut to you. I mean, it's quite obvious how you should be handling it, dependent upon the sensitivities. Yeah, but no, that's an excellent point. That's exactly what we would think the road you might go down with that. Okay, you want to do some planning for the conversion, and once again, this comes down to having done this initial work of actually identifying what it is from a records perspective that matters. Now, when it comes to SIARD, is quite simple. It's also free. It's a proprietary product, but it's free, and it has a lot of simplicity about it, which is actually quite nice. There are more elaborate products that cost a substantial amount of money, and they also have a substantial learning curve when it comes to using them. So the benefits we think with SIARD outweigh the benefits you might get from shifting to one of those other things. Certainly in the, when you're getting your head around this kind of thing to start off. So, very crudely put, SIARD can actually be selective in what it gets out in two ways, and they're pretty basic really, but one is quite elegant. It connects, as I said, to the database just the way an application would connect as a particular type of user. So you can connect as an administrator, or you can have these different roles that you have. And you're probably aware that if somebody logs in as a particular type of business user on a large database, a multi-purpose database, they'll actually only be able to see certain tables, and they won't see any of the finance, for instance. They won't see any of that. So the same principle applies. When you've got your copy of the database, you create another user just for the purpose of transfers, and you give that the privileges that are appropriate to the data that you want. And in some cases that will actually achieve what you want. In other cases, such as you can have mixed content where it's quite clear you don't want to take some of it and you need some other granularity, the second point comes in play. You're working off a copy of the database. You can actually do some gardening, and you're not touching the original data. So you just cut out the bits that you don't want to transfer, and SIARD won't transfer what's not there. And point three is you can use a combination of the two. But as I said, we don't want to get in too complicated a conversation about that kind of thing, because it really comes down to the answers to you can answer these sorts of things pretty clearly to yourself once you actually see the specific data you're working with. Okay, so to today's example, we're using a very small, quite simple database, which is an airline booking database, and it's storing data for a simple airline booking system. And this one is loaded into SQL Server 2008. We actually took this out of Ingress, so this is their demonstration database, so we migrated it out of there, but that's another story. So anyway, just very simply, let's have a very quick look at what we've got here. Nothing like going from a wide screen to a little one, narrow one. So here you go. Here we see, this is just a management tool for SQL Server, and here we can see the tables. So they're pretty. Oh, you may not be able to read those. We have an airline table, an airport table, countries, flight and day, route table, TZ. I can't remember what that is. Pardon? Time zone. Well done. Well, thank you. That is what it is. User profile and a version 1. Okay, so we can just have a look at the airlines, and you can see here, we can get some results down here. So not much data in it, but just what we want for the purpose of the demonstration. Okay, so you would go through your preparation, and then we get to the conversion. Okay. Now this is the GUI version. This is called SIARD Edit. The product, which is free, you can get it through the Swiss archives. It also comes with the command line versions, and we've run this on I think a 5.5 gigabyte database. I think it ran in 28 minutes converting, which we're quite pleased with. And the command line version runs in 80% of that time. So if you're doing big stuff, you may wish to use the command line tool. It's not hard to use. So here we go, SIARD edit, very simple interface. What we want to do, okay. And there you go. Don't work with children and animals and software. Excuse me for a moment while I'll go see what's going on with that. There we go. Yeah. Come back. We want to make a new SIARD archive from a database, and I'm just going to reuse names and give it a new version. So this is a demo DB. We're going from SQL Server. I'll call this one number 9. Okay, and next we come up with the connection information. So this is the bit where we're connecting to it as a user. And it stores connections, recently used connections here, so I'm going to be lazy and I'm going to reuse one. And that's my connection to SQL Server. So it's got some basic information about where the database is, and that database has a database user called DemoDB, and I'm doing this to help my memory because it's a hell of a job remembering all these. So we go to open and it starts running.
So you've opened that database from SIARD as a particular user,
Yes.
but you previously told it what to copy?
No, it's so I created that user and the user's in the database as a user, and and the connection information, the user has a password, so I connect to using its password, and it's copying out everything that user has access to, and it's done. So there we go. So it has reasonably good logging capabilities too, so when you do strike trouble, there's a log you can refer to. And so it has one database schema. The database schema has 8 tables. And there we go, there's those familiar tables again. And we have a SIARD file. So let's go have a look at it. And this actually may be pretty hard to read at the back, but the gist of it is it's pretty much all XML, and it's structured, for those of you who can read this, you'll start to see some familiarity here. So we're at the very top of it, we're looking at the table 0, and here we have the various columns in the database, the first database table, and it's just got their data types here. And we scroll down a little bit and you can actually see those columns and the data in each of those columns. So that's the first row in that database table, and you can even see here an airline name. Okay, so there's your data for that first table. Now, and so on and so on. So we go through the other tables. Now if I scoot right down to the bottom, I'll give you vertigo, let's go right down the bottom. And here we get the database schema being described. Okay, so here's the metadata for the database. So all in one file. You don't get any compression with this, so if you've got a 5 gigabyte database, you end up with a 5 gigabyte SIARD file, which is fine. And the beauty of SIARD is it stores it in quite an open format, and it's so in the future you could process this. You know, if time moves on, technology moves on, the file's quite open. You could actually reprocess it into anything else So it's a quite a nice format for that. And it's also quite readable. We could just look through there and we could say, oh yes, I understand what's going on in there. But when you get to anything of a decent size in a database, you'll be struggling to find anything that would actually load it even as a text editor and read it. So it's not you wouldn't get in there and do work in it by any means. But it's reassuring to know that you can actually see what's going on in there and what it's about. Now at this point in your agency, when you've gone through the process of preparing for the transfer, you've identified the data you want and you've created your SIARD file, the logical thing and the prudent thing to do would be to do some validation on that, just to make sure that you've got all the data that you're expecting. Now, validating between the XML file and the relational database is a problem. It is actually quite easy to validate it against another database, another relational database. So logically, we would suggest we load it into a database there and compare the two databases. Now, that's what we would do at this point, but we're going to leave it to a bit later because it requires me to load it into a database. So we know we're going to do that when we get to the archive bit. So why don't we go skip on and we'll jump back to validation towards the end. So here we go to making the VO, and I think I would be probably one of the least qualified people to make a VO in this place, but I will get so perhaps my explanation of it will be really pretty simple and short and sweet. All I've done, I've created a very, very simple VO, and I've given it a very, very small amount of information to create it from. I've given it the name that I want the VO to be. I've given it the name of the source SIARD file, and I've given it not a hell of a lot of extra information. And we've got a little VO creator tool here, and we're going to actually now point it at that SIARD file, and it's going to the VO creator will create it and sign it at the same time, and it wants a password. Good on it. So there we go, and it's done it. So how good is that? So let's go have a look at the VO. And here's one I prepared earlier. That one there. Not much earlier, just before I walked in here. So this is the same file, and it's been turned into a VO. And some of you may or may not have had a look inside these. You'll certainly get the opportunity to have a look at more VOs when Andrew presents. But this is using the current version 2, and I won't dwell an awful lot on this, but it's encoded, and we get past the signatures, we can get down to, there we go, that's your SIARD file, encoded, and it's as big as, it's pretty much the same size as the, slightly bigger than the SIARD file. So once again, you can imagine that we've got quite sophisticated ways of working with VOs. They're terrific to work with. These are getting quite big. They're still usable, and it's still a very good way of managing them, but they're just potentially another order of magnitude bigger than some of your basic document VOs. Okay, so here we are. We've got that created. Now, this is the point at which you would be transferring. So up until this point, this is the part of the process you manage yourselves, and naturally, we are very happy to help you through that process. But the object of it is managing transporting these will be the same as managing transferring physical documents. You'll manage it all up to the point in a conversation with our transfers and disposal people, and at the point at which it comes to transfer, that's no different. So it comes across to us, and at the current way the digital archive is and our collection is set up, we're not going to rush to have an automated system for loading these into the archive. What we will do is we'll store it with all the security that we store all our current objects under, and on an as-needed basis, when it's needed, we will then reconvert it back into a SIARD, back out of SIARD into a relational database and make it accessible. In many cases, it may actually be practicable for the user to actually reload it, or depending on what the request is, it may actually be practical for us to reload it and provide a report. So basically, if they want a record out of the database, we'll give them the record. So these things will be worked out on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so but by and large, the principle is there. If it's available, we'll make it available. Yep.
So it doesn't cost for it in the digital archive, or is it?
It's in an equivalent storage in terms of security and the like. So we can store them up to a certain size in the digital archive, and that's the VO will go through the digital archive in the same manner, and by doing that, you'll also be able to see it through the catalogue and get the descriptions, so you'll find out whether it's something you want. So it'll be discoverable if it's the type of content that is to be discoverable. So some of the stuff we hold may not be. So the idea is up to a certain size, there's no reason why they don't get ingested into the digital archive. If we get something that the current digital archive can't store, then we'll store it in the same security. And one way we're proposing to handle those is, in fact, to create two VOs, one with the full bells and whistles, which could be potentially huge, and also one without actually the SIARD file in it, but with all the metadata. So essentially that gets ingested, and that's the thing that comes up, and you can get all the descriptive information through the catalogue. And then it's a matter of provisioning it based upon requests. And so certainly as demand demands, we'll make decisions based upon that. Okay, so transfer to PROV is pretty much the same way as you transfer anything based upon its value, and there's no need to email things if they're pretty important. We're very happy to transfer them in the way that's appropriate to their security. These are not the things that you'll be doing, churning out 20 of these a week. So they're more of an occasional thing, and they're certainly the sort of thing that you would take some care handling, as we will. Okay, so unwrapping the VO. That's a bit we just covered. So essentially, if it needs to be accessed or reloaded, it just gets unwrapped and converted back into the SIARD format. Now, this is the process that we go through to make the database reinflated back into being a real database that people could search again. And that's what we will do. So we were in Microsoft SQL Server before, and just for the fun of it, we're going to go into MySQL, as pretend our archive is a MySQL archive. Okay, so the first simple step is what we want to do is just create an empty database to load the thing into, because SIARD will want to connect to a database to load things into. So there's a very simple creation script using my unbelievably predictable users and passwords, and we're just going to run that, and it's done. So it's now been created, and it's turned up there, and it's got nothing in it, but it sits there, and it's got a user associated with it, and we're going to make use of that user through SIARD to transfer that database into it. Okay. So there's my SQL Server demo DB that was converted into SIARD format. I've just brought it back up again, and I'm going to say load into a database, and using the same interface I'm going to actually pick out the connection to MySQL that I created earlier, and I'm going to put in my password, and I'm going to run it. and it will come up and ask me to confirm the schema mapping. So the schema that's currently called DemoDB in the previous one, do I want to have it called DemoDB in this one? And I must ask them one day, but there's this little quirk: if I don't put double quotes around it, as they say in the little dialogue at the top, it will get converted to all caps. So why don't we do that? We'll run it. Oh, it's failed. Isn't that perfect? We'll see how we go. Oh, it looks like it's loading. Fingers crossed. Alright, I saw one error in there. I'm actually going to ignore that because I don't like it. Anyway, it had some little problem in there. How would I? I saw it said the word failed in there. Yeah. And if this was real data and a real job, we would actually really investigate. You'd want to investigate that, get to the bottom of it. It may be actually nothing. It was dropping constraints, table constraints, and it may have dropped them because they weren't there. So it goes through the process of dropping tables in case they exist already before it loads them. It may have actually been that. It may have said, I can't drop it because it's not there. So here's hoping. Anyway, let's go have a look and see what we've got in MySQL now. And I'll just refresh that. And there's the tables. Okay? So, if we go look at the airlines, we'll select some airlines. Oops, select rows. And there's some airlines here. Okay? So it's loaded all in there.
So it's reading the XML from the SIARD file to tell SQL to create a table on the fly as it's going to be calculated.
That's right. That's what it does. And as we discussed earlier, I put up here our search interface for access to collection. But the general idea is it becomes available and will enable people to find things that we want them to, things that they should be able to find. And we'll certainly make sure they can't find things that they aren't supposed to find. Yes. Yep. Yeah. All there. Yeah. So yeah, it reproduces a relational model from the previous database. Yep, that's right. And what we're dealing with here too is we're dealing with an architecture where you've got the application sitting on top of the database. So you're getting the database across. You're not getting the front end. So you're not getting the graphical interface that the business users would be interacting with it through. And so we won't go into that a lot today. But essentially what you do is you document that as part of the transfer process. Is you want to produce a story to explain how it was used. You want to produce screenshots. Working with DHHS, we went and visited some users, and it was fabulous watching them use the system because you learn an awful lot as they talk you through how they use it. It's actually quite it quite often differs from how the manual says it gets used, and they have ways of making the application work for them to discover things that aren't written up anywhere. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge out in these things are used in socio-technical systems. People use them, and so the whole system is the thing that does the work. And so yeah. So essentially, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to provide people with the database so that you could conceivably run the same query on the archive and get the same answer as you would if you ran that query on the business system. Okay, which brings us nicely into validation. So why don't we have a look at that? There is a when it comes to validating the SIARD file itself, there is a third-party tool out called CostVal, and it was developed by some of the people who worked, I think, on the original SIARD stuff. in Switzerland. In any case, it works well enough. We could actually run it now. We could choose a file, and where are we going to look? Here we go. Okay, why don't we ask it about that one? And we'll ask it to validate it. There we go. And it said it passed. And it's going to open the log file, and that's all they've got in it. So there were no errors in terms of what it checked. This is a reassurance to some degree. But it's important when we use any of these validation tools to know what it's checking and to know what it's not checking. And so the documentation with this tool tells us what it checks. It's really checking the formality of the file, so it's making sure that it's got the elements, all the right elements for a SIARD file and the like. So it's an important test to do, but you can imagine that, you know, it's only a very small part of the story, isn't it? What about the data? So let's have a look at the data. If you were running identical systems, if you were basically making a copy of a database using the same product, same version, everything like that, just replicating them, it's possible you might be able to do checksums or something on the data, so you could actually come back with values that you could compare. Hardly ever would that be the case with what we would do here, because you're almost invariably going to a different product, and you're certainly probably going to a different version. So they're just not going to work. So checksums are very rarely going to be useful. What you can do, the bottom line is, if, as I said earlier, if you can put in the same query and get the same result, and so you would do some sampling in that way. You'd have take some queries from the existing database, and you'd run them on the new one and compare the results, see if you get the same things back. We've done some interesting stuff where we've run comparisons across 5 databases. We've converted it and moved it between products a lot, and yeah, it's very much worthwhile doing it. One other way, and all these queries are done basically using SQL queries. This is one which is actually, it's quite useful, and we're currently able to run it on single tables, but you could actually maybe write it so it would run through all the tables in the database potentially. This, I don't know if you can read the text in this query. This is a standard query that says select everything from the MySQL database table called country, except the rows that are also in the SQL Server database table country. Okay, so only return the rows that aren't in the other one. And in order to look at the other side of the coin, we have a union there where we flip those select queries, and we're saying select from the SQL Server table country except where it appears in the MySQL table country. So in any case, if we run that, it will give us the column names, but it won't give us a result. So it didn't find anything that wasn't in one or the other. In terms of matching, they matched. So if we went back to the SQL Server database and we looked at country, and we went to make a change, and what if I'll put something in there that's easy for me to find later on. I'll put a Z on the end of Germany, just for the hell of it. And what if I run that again? Look at that. It's given me a line back. It's found the line, and I could go back there and delete that and run it again, and it'll come back with nothing. So this is an area that's clearly worth developing much further. But this is the idea. The acid test is, can you do the same query on one and get the same result? And as time goes on, we'll certainly you know, share with you where we get with these things. But yeah, there's lots can be done with satisfying yourself that you've got the same data. These things, once again, the idea of doing this testing yourself is because when you send it to us as a VO, we'll check the VO for formality, making sure it's a proper VO and making sure it's a proper SIARD file. If there's no request for that for some years, it's going to be pretty hard to work out whether or not it's the right data or not. If you bear in mind that the process you go through preparing for the transfer, your team and the people you work with who are supporting you technically, the knowledge that gets built up about the specific database, the way it worked and the business it did, actually puts you in a very, very good position to work out what you need to be testing. Okay, so you build up so much expert knowledge at that point that you're in an ideal position to test what matters. So I've got a few slides here just to briefly talk about some of the more general ideas about how you might manage these projects. Just a few ideas, thoughts, and then we might take some questions. These are some ideas in terms of the way these things proceed. The process for finding a database that you think might be a candidate for transfer can take a little bit of time. If you can get hold of any of your asset registers for the organisation, you can run your finger down there, and some of them may jump out because by the description of it or the name of it even, you may see that maps on really well to something that's a priority for protection or transfer, that kind of thing. So you may actually be able to triage a bit straight away just by getting hold of some of these registers. But when you start doing them, the reality is they all proceed at different paces. Some might be reasonably straightforward, and you won't have a question about how to get access to it, for instance. Some of them you may be waiting for some time in order for the right people to talk to you to transfer things over. There may be some complexities around the content of it, like managing mixed content, that legitimately warrant some important analysis and conversations to work out the best way of doing it. And there's no point in trying to put that through a sausage machine. They take as long as they need to take. So bearing all that in mind, don't ever expect that these things you can sort of map them out and say, oh, that'll take 2 months, that'll take 2 months, we'll just get a sausage machine going here and knock them all off. It makes sense to me that what you really want to do is you want to find out what you've got out there, and then maybe triage a bit, work out, well, what should we be looking at first, and have some criteria for that perhaps. And then basically maybe just lay them all out and have a list of items that you think are worthy of investigating. And then progressively you will actually see, as you make progress with one, you might actually see it inches further forward towards being converted and transferred. You might see other ones. It's like a turtle race or something. At some point, one of them will get over the line, and the other ones will eventually get there. But there's no telling the speed at which each one will travel at. So it makes sense to me that what you want to do is you probably want to have a number of these at various stages, because you're not going to work on them all at the same time. You're going to work on them when your resources are available. And because this is one of those things where you do collaborate a fair bit on it, it'll also progress based upon the availability of other people who you need to talk to. And nobody's going to drop everything to do all of these things in a timely fashion. So it makes sense that you actually you have them there, and you can actually see when you're making progress with each of them. And if you have a few on the go, you'll have one where you may be looking at some of the technical aspects. You'll have another one where you're doing some of the documentation for transfer. You'll have a variety of different phases that you're going through, and you fit them into your work plan. But at least you've got a work plan. And if you've also got an asset register or some kind of information architecture that you can lay out as the big picture, then you can actually start to see, well, yeah, we are actually working on some of the areas that we think are priorities, because you obviously want to be doing what's the most important thing to be doing at that time. So yeah, commence multiple concurrent transfers, I think is the way to go. these are interesting, they're novel, they generate some excitement within, within organisations in some areas. Ultimately, though, it's business as usual, and it's as I said at the beginning, it's a management thing. It's a management tool, which is making use of a records management capability, which in turn is making use of some project management capabilities, and that is making use of a technology transfer process. So it's not about the technology. That's actually, it's really a much higher level thing, and it goes right back to the obligations of the agency under the Act. That's what you're doing. Everybody's just being asked to do their job. They're not being asked to do you a big favour in this. So it's really a management process, and we're going to encourage sharing, because there's lots of things about the discovery process that is quite rightly between you and us in certain respects. However, when we look back at those technical things, when you're looking at a particular database and you have a little workaround, you come up with an idea for how to get that one working, that's infinitely shareable. And when somebody else solves a problem equally, that's shareable. So with the ingress, we came up with a workaround for that. There's nothing in there that has any private information in it. It's just a pretty straightforward procedure. So there's no reason why we shouldn't all be able to just get them all out of the same bucket and not have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to solving these little individual issues that you do encounter from time to time. Okay. A number of jurisdictions are actively trialling it and very keen to go forward with it. It's one of those issues that interestingly we approach it in different ways, but it can be on the face of it a little daunting, a little complex, and so so we've collaborated and communicated a lot with other states, and so it's an ongoing conversation. So, and as I said, the format itself has gives us a lot of confidence that it'll be usable in the future, regardless of whether SIARD is still being used in 5 years' time. It'd be nice to think, in fact, that it may get superseded by something better and more powerful, and by then we'll all be ready for that, because we will have had a few years of doing this stuff ourselves anyway. So we all grow as we do these things. But it actually still remains essentially an XML file, and that's an infinitely usable thing into the future. And as I said, some of the stuff to do with getting big stuff into the archive, managing how we would provide records to people, all that sort of stuff, that, there's multiple ways of doing that, and we're still working out some of the detail on that. But essentially, we would accept a VO as a SIARD VO tomorrow, if importantly, if it basically met all the usual criteria that every other transfer of every other format is expected to meet. So it's no different in that respect. Coming back to the fact that it's a transfer, it's just a transfer using a different thing, and that's all of that. But certainly, very much encourage you to have a chat to us anytime about. We took a long time. I'll give you an example. We had an ingress database that we took some time to figure out a workaround, and we're just using a free third-party data integration tool to migrate it, and it works fine. It's very straightforward. And once we did that, it actually could speed up doing other migrations using that. Having said that, however, the very next one that we had to look at had a whole lot of sensitivities around it from a content perspective, and so that one will progress really, really slowly, even though we now actually have all the, I guess, the technical stuff solved to a large extent. So so it can be anything, and I haven't seen it. There's no pattern emerged Yeah.
Seems reasonable to say based on what you've dissertation. Thank you very much. Seems reasonable to say that that there's actually quite a bit of normal archive records management research required about the database, the contents, the purpose, all that normal stuff. That seems to me the big component. And actually having good system documentation, user documentation, you know, that is probably critical to a smooth conversion. Would that be reasonable to say?
Yeah, the first point, I agree completely. That's why I felt it was important to preface this. It's an opportunity to look at the bits working because we don't see them. So it's hard to actually get our head around exactly, well, what's it look like, how's it work. So that's really what we wanted to do today. But it's in the context of the fact that, yeah, it is really all about all those normal intellectual exercises of preparing for transfers and understanding it. The second point on the user documentation and the manuals and all that stuff, I haven't seen one yet for anything. I haven't seen one yet for really big systems. And so, yeah, they are out there, I'm sure. But yeah, quite amazingly, or finding the person who actually knows where they are is quite a trip.
I've got a part two to my question.
Yeah.
Because we have 8 or so databases that maybe need to be converted and transferred, none of which are operating anymore, because they are actually a previous generation, which were subject to an extremely poor migration about 5 years ago. Incomplete data, all sorts of stuff. So in fact, it's looking to me like maybe preserving those original databases is important. But they're not operating really.
Yeah, it needs to be running on something. Even if you don't have the front end, like the interface available, it needs to be loadable into something. Okay, yeah, and so then that's a useful start. That would be your starting point. Yeah, is you can get a copy. Well, no, because as I said, there's a bunch of different validation is a whole bunch of different things, and it can be as simple as can you compare the data in each row and satisfy yourself that address is the same as the address that you've got in the other one. Yeah. No, so I don't think it's worth oversimplifying anything, trivialising any of these things. But some of them may actually do not become really big problems once you actually look at the specifics. But equally, you can actually look at other things, and they can take a long time to actually hunt down what's going on. But yeah, so if you've got it's worth having a look at, that kind of thing. Yes.
Sorry, my question. When did you start using this process of setting this up?
Well, we're happy to talk to you about it when you're ready to, and so it's a matter of having initial discussion is really helpful. These tools, all the tools that I've shown you today are all free, and they're all free for you to use at your workplace, sort of thing. So the licensing is through the Swiss Federal Archive, and you just basically register and get it for free. So certainly we'd very happy to have a conversation with you. Every meeting you have and every getting your hands dirty on something is a really useful thing, which is like, even if in the first instance we just found somewhere at your place where you can set it up on a computer and we can actually use pre-existing data just so you can do it, because there's nothing quite like doing it. Even if you don't intend in the long run to actually be getting your hands on all that stuff, just actually running it yourself with our help is I think it really gives you a good handle on exactly what you're asking other people to do. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I think that's the end of my bit, and thank you very much for being so patient and getting through that. But yeah, certainly give us a call, contact us, and if you want to follow up on any of these bits, because we're very happy to talk to you about it. And we'll take it from there. Thanks very much. Thanks for your time.